Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where we uncover the most terrifying and chilling mysteries. Today, we're diving into the world of the scariest haunted stories, tales that will send shivers down your spine. From wandering spirits in the dead of night to cursed souls and unexplainable supernatural events, these stories will leave you questioning reality. But the most spine-chilling of all? The haunted house. A place shrouded in mystery, where eerie deaths and restless spirits still linger. And then there's the demonic phantom, a dark, malevolent entity that strikes fear into anyone who dares to enter its domain. Are you ready to face the unknown? Let's find out, if you dare. Story 1. The Haunted Blackwood Manor. Every legend begins with a story, but this is no legend. It is a tale of terror that has transcended time, a doorway into darkness that no one dares to cross. Jack Harrison, an ambitious young journalist, was always on the lookout for compelling stories. His YouTube channel, dedicated to the supernatural, had gained significant traction. When he heard about the Blackwood Manor, a decrepit, abandoned house whispered to be cursed, he saw it as the perfect opportunity to film first-hand evidence of the paranormal. Ignoring the warnings from the townsfolk, he packed his camera gear and set out for the infamous location. The house loomed ominously against the night sky, its once grand exterior now nothing more than a skeleton of rotting wood and shattered windows. There were no signs or markings, but everyone in town knew that the Blackwood family had mysteriously vanished on a stormy night decades ago, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and the scent of decay. The front door creaked open under Jack's touch, the hinges letting out a shrill wail as if protesting his intrusion. The air inside was heavy, laden with dust and the musty stench of abandonment. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating cracked walls, broken furniture, and the remnants of a life long forgotten. But as he stepped into the grand hallway, something felt wrong. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was inhaling his presence. The floorboards beneath him groaned, shifting slightly under his weight. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Jack spun around, his pulse hammering in his ears. He was alone, or so he thought. His camera lens scanned the room, capturing the eerie silence. Then, just as he steadied his breath, he heard it. A low, guttural laugh reverberating from the second floor. A shiver crawled down his spine. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to leave, but his curiosity urged him forward. Clutching his camera tightly, he began his ascent up the decaying staircase, each step groaning in protest. Halfway up, the temperature plummeted. Jack's breath became visible, wisps of fog curling from his lips. A sense of dread pressed against his chest. Then, from the darkness ahead, something moved. His flashlight flickered, barely illuminating the shadowy figure at the top of the stairs. It was tall, inhumanly so, its elongated limbs stretching toward him. Two piercing red eyes glowed in the darkness, burning into his soul. A wide, jagged mouth split open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The sound that followed was neither a growl nor a scream, but something inhuman, something from the depths of a nightmare. Jack stumbled backward, nearly toppling down the stairs. His camera caught every chilling detail, the lens shaking in his trembling hands. The figure lunged, but as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. Panting, Jack pressed himself against the railing, trying to steady his breath. He needed to get out, now. But the moment he turned, he found himself in a different hallway entirely. The walls stretched impossibly long, the doors multiplying, twisting, morphing into grotesque shapes. The house was shifting, reshaping itself, trapping him in its labyrinthine grasp. The laughter returned, this time echoing from every direction. Jack broke into a run, His only thought? Escape. He turned corner after corner, but no matter where he ran, he ended up back in the same room, the living room, where he had first entered. And then, the lights went out. The darkness swallowed him whole. His flashlight flickered and died. Silence settled over the house, an oppressive void that pressed against his ears. Then came the whispers, dozens of them, some weeping, some laughing, some begging. A cold breath caressed the back of his neck. Jack didn't turn. He couldn't, but a voice, as clear as day, whispered into his ear, "You shouldn't have come." His blood ran cold. Something unseen wrapped around his limbs, pulling him down deeper into the floor. He thrashed, clawing at the wooden planks, but they melted beneath his fingers, turning into a black, swirling abyss. As he was dragged into the darkness, the last thing he saw was the reflection of his own horrified face in the camera's shattered screen. And the last thing he heard was the laughter, endless, mocking, consuming him entirely. Jack awoke in a different place. Not the manor, but somewhere far worse. The walls pulsed like they were alive, coated with a dark, slimy substance that smelled of rot and decay. Distant screams echoed from unseen corridors. He was no longer in the Blackwood Manor. He was inside something else. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It was the creature he had seen before, only now it was closer, towering over him. Its elongated fingers reached for him, curling around his throat. The whispers turned into shrieks, a cacophony of torment that rattled his very bones. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came. His lungs burned, his vision blurred. The last thing he saw was the creature's mouth opening wider than should be possible, revealing an endless void filled with writhing, damned souls. The walls around him closed in, pulsing like veins, beating to the rhythm of his terror. The air became thick, suffocating him. Shadows crawled toward him, clawing at his flesh, whispering forgotten names in his ears. The creature's laughter became deafening, each note slicing through his sanity. The next morning, Blackwood Manor stood as silent as ever. The door, which had shut behind Jack, was ajar once more, as if inviting another foolish soul inside. Jack was never seen again. And his camera? It was found lying in the front yard, its recording still playing. The sound of Jack's screams. But something was different. The footage continued after the screams faded. A new voice spoke from the darkness. "Who's next?" And in the reflection of the shattered lens, the camera caught something new. Jack was there, or rather, what was left of him. His eyes were hollow, his face twisted in agony, his mouth silently screaming. Trapped. Inside the house. Forever. Story 2. The Haunting Breath. Emily Carter had always lived alone, but it wasn't until she moved into the apartment on Oakwood Street that she truly understood what loneliness felt like. At first, it was just little things. Whispers when she was falling asleep, a cold draft brushing her neck when the windows were closed. She tried to ignore it, to rationalize it, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. It started with the mirror in her bedroom. Every time she looked at it for too long, she saw something. A shadow moving behind her. A glimpse of a distorted smile that wasn't her own. One night, as she was brushing her hair, she received a text message from an unknown number. "Emily, don't turn around." Her blood ran cold. She stared at the screen, frozen. Every instinct in her body told her not to look, but curiosity won. Slowly, she turned her head. There was nothing there. But in the reflection, standing right behind her, was a figure cloaked in darkness, eyes burning red with malice. Emily screamed and spun around, but the room was empty. Her mirror, however, had changed. It no longer reflected her. Instead, it showed a dark corridor stretching endlessly into nothingness. The nightmares grew worse. She dreamt of being dragged into that corridor, hands clawing at her skin, voices whispering her name in a language she didn't understand. She began waking up with scratches on her arms and bruises on her legs. The apartment grew colder each night, the shadows lengthening unnaturally. Then came the breathing. At first, it was soft, almost indistinct. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. It was as if someone, or something, was standing just behind her, exhaling against her skin. She could feel it. One night, she woke up to find her blanket being pulled off her bed, slowly, deliberately. She clutched at it desperately, but an unseen force yanked it away. The breathing grew louder, deeper. Emily tried to leave. She packed her bags, determined to escape. But when she opened the door, she found herself back inside her bedroom. No matter how many times she ran for the exit, she always ended up back in that room. The entity wouldn't let her go. She smashed the mirror, hoping to destroy whatever was haunting her. But the next morning, it was whole again. Worse yet, her reflection was gone. When she looked into it, she saw only darkness, an abyss filled with shifting figures, watching her hungrily. Days turned to weeks. Emily stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The apartment devoured her sanity, whispering terrible things into her ears, promising that she would never leave. The final straw came when she saw herself standing in the hallway, but it wasn't really her. The doppelganger grinned at her, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. "Come join us," it whispered. Emily tried one last desperate act. She gathered every mirror in the apartment and smashed them all to pieces. The fragments littered the floor, each shard reflecting grotesque, twisted versions of herself. But it was too late. The apartment had claimed her. The next morning, Emily was gone. Her apartment was found in pristine condition, except for one thing: the mirror. It now bore the faint outline of a screaming face, trapped forever within the glass. Months passed. A new tenant moved in, unaware of the chilling history of the place. For a while, everything seemed normal. But then, she started noticing strange things. The occasional whisper, the cold breath against her skin. And then one night, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Don't turn around." The cycle had begun again. Nobody dared to rent the apartment after that. But sometimes, at night, passers-by claimed to hear something. A breath. Slow, deep, waiting. And if you stand too close to the mirror, you might see Emily, still watching, still waiting, for the next soul to take her place. Story 3. The Nightmare Beyond the Window. Olivia Reynolds had always enjoyed living alone. Her apartment on the 12th floor overlooked the entire city, giving her a sense of peace and isolation that she found comforting. But as the days grew colder and the nights stretched longer, something about her home began to change. It started subtly. Small noises in the dark, flickering shadows in the corner of her vision, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. At first, she dismissed it. The mind plays tricks on you, especially in a high-rise where the wind howls through the windows and distant city sounds echo at night. But what wasn't normal was the knocking. It started at 3:15 a.m. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the window pane. She figured it was the wind or maybe a bird, but it happened every single night, always at the same time. At first, Olivia ignored it. Then she grew annoyed. Finally, curiosity got the better of her. One night, fed up and half awake, She pulled back the curtains, expecting to see nothing but the city skyline. Instead, she saw eyes. Burning, glowing red eyes staring at her from beyond the glass. A massive clawed hand pressed against the window, streaking jagged scratches into the glass. The creature's face was skeletal, its mouth filled with rows of needle-like teeth, grinning at her as it exhaled a deep, raspy breath against the cold surface. Olivia stumbled back, heart hammering, fumbling for her phone. But when she looked again, it was gone. The next morning, she found deep scratches on the window, too deep to be from an animal. When she checked her phone's security footage, there was nothing. No creature, no eyes, no knocking. Just an empty, quiet night. That night, the knocking returned. Louder, more insistent. It wasn't just tapping, it was scraping. A slow, agonizing sound, like nails dragging across a chalkboard. Olivia refused to look. She buried herself under the covers, covering her ears, trying to drown it out. Then she heard it. "Let me in." Her breath hitched. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the apartment. Olivia turned, heart pounding, and saw something standing at the foot of her bed. The same figure from the window. Only now it was inside. Its breath was rancid, its mouth twisted into a grin too wide for its face. She screamed. The lights flickered violently as she scrambled for her phone. But when she turned on the flashlight, it was gone. She barely slept after that. Her nights became a waking nightmare. Every night, the knocking, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. The window became something sinister, something alive. One night, she woke up to the sound of the window creaking open. The locks were still in place, but somehow it was opening inch by inch. A long, clawed hand reached inside, fingers curling, reaching for her. She ran, and didn't stop. Olivia fled to a hotel, leaving everything behind. She didn't care about the rent, the lease, she just wanted to be far away. But as she lay in bed that night, trying to find some sense of normalcy, her phone buzzed with a notification. A message from an unknown number. "Why did you leave?" Her blood turned to ice. Slowly, she turned to the hotel window. And there, pressed against the glass, was the creature. Grinning, waiting, knocking. The knocking never stopped, and neither did the whispers. She was never seen again. But her story didn't end there. The apartment remained vacant for months. No one wanted to live in the place where Olivia had disappeared. The landlord tried to rent it out, but every new tenant complained of strange disturbances, the feeling of being watched, shadows that moved on their own, and of course, the knocking at 3:15 a.m. One particularly brave man, Daniel Hughes, moved in, dismissing the rumors as superstition. The first night was quiet. The second night, he woke up to a cold draft, despite the windows being shut. The third night, the knocking began. Soft at first, then louder, more desperate. Daniel ignored it. Then came the whispers. "Let me in." Daniel froze. He turned, expecting to see nothing, but his blood ran cold when he noticed the closet door was slightly ajar. A pair of glowing red eyes peered at him from the darkness. Terrified, he reached for his phone, but before he could react, the closet door burst open. A cold, clawed hand wrapped around his wrist, yanking him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the empty apartment before abruptly cutting off. The next morning, the apartment was empty again. The cycle continued. Tenants came and went, each lasting shorter than the last. Eventually, the landlord gave up and sealed the apartment for good. But even then, at 3:15 a.m., passers-by swore they could hear the knocking. And sometimes, if they looked up, they would see a face pressed against the window, grinning, waiting, still knocking. Story 4. The place not meant for the living. The night was pitch black. A thick mist shrouded the desolate graveyard, where only moss-covered tombstones and skeletal remains lay. The wind howled through the night, carrying eerie whispers, as if tormented souls were crying out in the darkness. The gnarled old trees, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, stood like spectral hands ready to drag the living into the cold earth. Ethan, a young and fearless man, walked among the crumbling graves. He did not believe in ghosts, nor was he afraid of the chilling tales surrounding this place. Accepting a dare from his friends, Ethan took on the challenge to enter the graveyard at midnight, convinced that everything was mere superstition. But the deeper he ventured, the stronger the unease creeping into his mind. The graves became more distinct under the pale moonlight. One, in particular, stood out. A cracked tombstone bore strange, ancient inscriptions in an unknown language. The ground around it appeared freshly disturbed, as if something had clawed its way out. Creak. A dry, hollow sound echoed behind him. Ethan whirled around, his heart pounding, but there was nothing except the swirling mist. His breathing quickened. The air grew heavier, suffocating, as though unseen eyes were watching his every move. Then suddenly, a pale, skeletal hand slowly emerged from the earth right before his eyes. Ethan staggered backward, his heartbeat deafening in his ears. He struggled to keep his composure, but terror gnawed at his sanity. The skeletal hand continued to rise, dragging up a shriveled, decayed figure, its long, matted hair covering its face. A rancid stench filled the air. Two deep, black eyes opened, staring straight at Ethan. This was no human. This was something from the abyss. Ethan couldn't scream. An invisible force pinned him in place. The entity crawled out of the grave, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. Its mouth stretched grotesquely wide, revealing razor-sharp teeth glistening in the moonlight. It let out a high-pitched screech and lunged toward Ethan. Ethan bolted. The tombstones around him seemed to shift, skeletal hands clawing from the dirt, reaching to ensnare him. He ran and ran, but the path never ended. The world around him twisted, warping into a nightmarish realm where life no longer existed. At last, Ethan tripped and fell. He looked up and his stomach churned. Before him stood a massive rusted gate, adorned with grotesque carvings of screaming faces. An old, tattered sign above it dripped with blood-red letters. "This place is not for the living." A cold, lifeless hand clutched Ethan's shoulder. He turned and froze in terror. It was himself. A perfect copy, but its face was distorted, its hollow eyes void of any humanity. It smiled, a smile devoid of life. Then it whispered, "You have been dead for a long time. You just never realized it." Ethan tried to scream, but no sound escaped. He looked down. His legs were crumbling into dust. His body disintegrated piece by piece, as if some unseen force was tearing him apart. He fought against it, desperately clinging to his last threads of existence. But darkness consumed him. The next morning, Ethan's friends arrived at the graveyard to search for him, only to find a fresh tombstone bearing his name. The date of death marked as the previous night. They fled in panic, but from behind them, a voice called out, "Don't worry, you'll all join me soon." As they turned, Ethan stood there, his skin pale, his eyes vacant, his smile twisted. He was no longer their friend. He was now a part of the graveyard, and he would not let them leave. The rusted gate creaked shut behind them. A scream echoed in the night, but no one was left to hear it. Story 5. The Curse of the Graveyard Witch. The night was thick with mist, swallowing the full moon in its hazy embrace. The graveyard stretched for miles, a forgotten place where the dead were not at rest. Jagged tombstones jutted from the ground like broken teeth, their inscriptions faded by time and neglect. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and something else, something rotten, something decayed. In the heart of the cemetery, an ancient grave lay undisturbed for centuries. No name was carved into its surface, only deep claw marks that marred the stone. Legend whispered that beneath it rested the graveyard witch, an entity of pure malevolence, bound by an unholy curse. The elders in town spoke of her in hushed voices, warning travelers never to step foot near her resting place. But curiosity has always been humanity's greatest weakness. That night, a group of 5 friends ventured into the graveyard, their laughter and bravado echoing through the stillness. They had heard the tales, but none believed in ghosts, let alone in a cursed witch buried beneath the soil. The leader of the group, Jason, carried a flashlight, its weak glow barely penetrating the thick darkness. Behind him, Emily, Ryan, Sarah, and Mark followed closely, their breaths visible in the chill of the night. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily muttered, hugging herself. "Relax," Jason scoffed. "It's just an old cemetery. What, you think the dead are going to wake up and chase us?" His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. As if in response, a gust of wind howled through the trees, making the branches tremble like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The friends stopped in their tracks as they spotted the nameless grave, the one from the legends. Ryan bent down, tracing the deep scratches on the stone with his fingers. "This is weird. These marks, they look fresh." Sarah swallowed hard. "Let's just go. We've seen it, took the dare, and now we can leave." But Jason, ever the fearless leader, grinned. "Not yet. We have to prove we were here." He pulled out a pocket knife and pressed the blade against his palm. A little blood sacrifice, just for fun. Before anyone could stop him, he let a few drops of blood drip onto the grave. The silence that followed was absolute. The air grew thick, pressing against their lungs like unseen hands. Then, the earth trembled. A low, guttural moan rose from beneath the soil. The grave cracked open with a sickening crunch. The friends stumbled backward as a skeletal hand, its nails long and sharp as talons, clawed its way out of the dirt. A figure emerged, its skin stretched tight over its skull, eyes glowing a sickly yellow. The graveyard witch had awakened. She towered over them, her jaw unhinging unnaturally wide, revealing jagged teeth dripping with blackened ichor. Her voice slithered through the air, a sound more felt than heard. "Who dares? Wake me." Jason, now pale as death, stammered, It was just a joke." The witch grinned, her rotting lips peeling back. "A joke? Then laugh, as you die." She raised her hands, and the graveyard came alive. Decayed corpses erupted from their tombs, their sunken eyes locking onto the terrified friends. The witch shrieked, and the dead obeyed. Panic set in. They ran, weaving between gravestones, their screams swallowed by the endless night. One by one, they fell. Ryan was the first. A skeletal hand burst from the ground, grabbing his ankle, yanking him down. His screams turned to gurgles as he was dragged into the darkness. Sarah tripped over a broken tombstone, her desperate cries echoing before bony fingers wrapped around her throat. She was pulled into an open grave, her nails leaving bloody trails on the stone as she fought against the inevitable. Mark and Emily ran hand in hand, but something moved too fast behind them. Mark shoved Emily forward just as claws tore through his back, his body arching in pain before he was yanked into the abyss. Emily reached the graveyard gates, her breath ragged, her hands trembling as she tried to push them open. But they wouldn't budge, rusted shut. Behind her, Jason was still running, the witch floating above him, her laughter reverberating through the cemetery. Emily turned just in time to see the witch's fingers wrap around his skull. His body convulsed, and with a sickening crunch, his head twisted unnaturally. Emily screamed. The witch turned her gaze toward her, tilting her head like a curious predator. Emily clawed at the gate, tears streaming down her face. "Please, please let me go." The witch floated closer, her foul breath filling Emily's nostrils. "You woke me. Now you stay." Emily's body jerked violently as invisible hands dragged her backward. The last thing she saw was the sky vanishing as the earth swallowed her whole. The graveyard fell silent once more. The nameless grave, now sealed again, bore fresh scratches, deep, frantic claw marks that hadn't been there before. By morning, the town awoke to news of 5 missing teenagers. No one dared enter the graveyard. No one spoke of the legend. But as the full moon rose again the following night, a faint whisper echoed through the cemetery. Who's next? And yet, the horror did not end there. The witch was no longer confined to her grave. The town soon became plagued with whispers in the night, shadows moving unnaturally, and the sound of scratching at doors. Those who dared speak of the legend were found with their mouths sewn shut, their eyes wide in eternal terror. One by one, the townspeople began to disappear. Some vanished in their sleep, while others were seen wandering into the graveyard, their faces blank, their bodies moving stiffly as if controlled by unseen hands. None ever returned. As the years passed, the town was abandoned, left to rot under the weight of its cursed past. Yet the graveyard remained untouched, the nameless tomb still standing. And every full moon, a new set of claw marks would appear on the stone, fresh, deep, desperate. Some say the witch is still waiting, hungry for more souls to feed on. And if you listen closely in the dead of night, you might hear the faint whisper of the forgotten. Who's next? Story 6. The Night of the Haunted Spirit. The town of Ravenshade had always been quiet. A place where time seemed to stand still, its people living peacefully among the autumn leaves and cobblestone streets. But there was something about Halloween night that set the town on edge. Every October 31st, as the moon reached its highest peak, an eerie silence would settle over the town, as though the very air itself held its breath. The legend was well known among the townsfolk, whispered in hushed voices and warned against by the elders. The tale of the Phantom of Ravenshade, a vengeful specter that returned once every 100 years to claim the souls of the living. It was said that if you heard your name carried in the wind on Halloween night, it was already too late. This year, the centennial anniversary of the Phantom's last visit, the town was on high alert. Doors were locked, windows were boarded, and candles burned in every home, warding off the darkness. Yet despite their precautions, the spirit had already chosen its victims. At precisely midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the streets with a voice that was not entirely human. The town's festive jack-o'-lanterns flickered wildly before their flames extinguished one by one, plunging the streets into an unnatural darkness. And then it appeared. A figure materialized in the center of the street, rising from the mist like a nightmare given form. Cloaked in flowing white, its hollow mouth was frozen in a scream of eternal agony. Its bony fingers twitched as it stretched toward the homes, its presence suffocating, its shadow stretching impossibly long beneath it. A single mournful wail pierced the silence. The hunt had begun. In one of the homes, a young boy named Ethan lay awake in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard the stories, but he had never truly believed them. Until now. The moment he heard his name whispered outside his window, his breath caught in his throat. Ethan. The whisper slithered through the air like an icy breath on the back of his neck. Trembling, he clutched his blanket tighter and squeezed his eyes shut. If he didn't move, maybe it would go away. But then he heard it again. Ethan, come outside. A chill ran through his veins. Against every instinct, he turned his head slightly, just enough to glimpse through the window. The phantom was there, waiting, watching, smiling. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He wanted to run, wanted to wake his parents, but his body was frozen in terror. Then, without warning, the window burst open, and the phantom's long, shadowy fingers slithered into the room, wrapping around his ankle. The boy let out a strangled gasp as he was yanked from his bed. He clawed at the floor, kicking and struggling, but the grip was unbreakable. The last thing he saw was his bedroom door swinging open, his mother standing there, her face twisted in horror, before he was dragged into the darkness. Ethan was only the first. As the phantom drifted through the town, doors creaked open on their own, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and whispers filled the air, each calling the name of a new victim. One by one, people disappeared, ripped from their homes, stolen from their beds. The phantom did not simply kill, it erased. There was no blood, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Only silence where life once was. The town's priest, Father Alden, attempted to fight back, standing in the street with his Bible clutched tightly in his shaking hands. He chanted prayers, invoking the power of God to banish the specter. The phantom merely turned to him, its hollow eyes glowing like dying embers. The priest's body twisted violently, his bones snapping as if crushed by an invisible force. His final scream was cut off as his mouth sewed itself shut, his lifeless body dropping to the ground with a sickening crunch. The town watched in horror. They knew now, nothing could stop it. By the time dawn approached, Ravenshade was a ghost town. Homes stood empty, their doors hanging ajar. The once cheerful jack-o'-lanterns now bore twisted expressions of terror, as though they too had witnessed the horror firsthand. But the phantom was not finished. There was still one soul left to claim. A girl, no older than 12, stood alone in the middle of the street. Her parents were gone. Her friends were gone. She was the last. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched a small stuffed rabbit to her chest, staring at the phantom with wide, terror-stricken eyes. The spirit hovered closer, its mouth widening impossibly as it let out a whisper so soft, so gentle, it could almost be mistaken for kindness. "Don't be afraid. You'll never be alone again." And with that, the darkness swallowed her whole. When the sun rose, the town of Ravenshade no longer existed. There were no bodies, no remains, only abandoned houses and streets coated in a layer of frost. The phantom had taken everything. It had fed on fear, on souls, and now it had returned to the darkness, waiting once more, for the next 100 years. And if you ever pass by the place where Ravenshade once stood, you might hear it, the wind whispering softly through the trees, calling a name, waiting for the next soul to claim. But this time, the phantom was not satisfied. It had devoured an entire town, but its hunger had only grown stronger. Instead of returning to the void, it lingered in the shadows, seeping into the surrounding forests, stretching beyond the ruins of Ravenshade. It began to wander. Nearby towns spoke of strange occurrences, children disappearing from their beds, eerie shadows gliding through the streets at midnight, whispers creeping into dreams. People found claw marks on their walls, windows shattered without reason, and their names echoed in the wind. The phantom no longer waited for 100 years. It was always there, and soon every town would know its name. The hunt had only just begun. Story 7. The Screaming Woman. The abandoned asylum had long been a blot on the town's history, an eerie reminder of the horrors committed within its decayed walls. Some whispered that the patients were tortured. Others believed it was something far darker, that the asylum had become a gateway to something evil. But no story was as feared as that of the Screaming Woman. No one knew her real name. She had been a patient once, locked away for reasons lost to time. But what remained were the screams. Those who dared to approach the asylum swore they could hear them still, shrill and desperate, echoing through the ruined hallways. Some said she had been murdered by the doctors. Others claimed she had killed them instead. One thing was certain: she never left. Michael, Rachel, and Josh were typical thrill seekers, drawn to urban legends and abandoned places. The asylum, with its reputation and endless corridors, was the perfect challenge. They wanted proof that it was all just stories, that ghosts weren't real. It was just a building after all. Or so they thought. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they climbed the rusted fence and slipped inside. The moment their feet touched the cracked tile floor, the air grew heavy. Dust swirled in the dim light, and the scent of rot filled their lungs. "This place is seriously messed up," Rachel muttered. Michael smirked. "Exactly why we're here." Josh checked his camera. "Let's make this count." They moved deeper into the asylum, the silence pressing in around them. Every footstep echoed, swallowed by the endless hallways. The building felt alive. Then they found the blood. A long crimson smear streaked across the floor, leading into the darkness. It was fresh. Too fresh. Rachel swallowed hard. "Guys, I don't think we're alone." Michael scoffed. "It's probably just old stains." But Josh wasn't so sure. His fingers trembled on the camera. Something about the air felt wrong. Then came the whisper. Low, hissing. Their names. Rachel turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Josh nodded slowly. His pulse pounded in his ears. Michael laughed nervously. "Okay, maybe this place is a little freaky." Then the lights flickered. A deep guttural breath filled the corridor. And then, the scream. A piercing, inhuman shriek that rattled the walls, splitting through their skulls like glass shattering in their brains. Rachel dropped to her knees, clutching her ears. Josh stumbled back, his camera shaking in his hands. Michael stood frozen, his breath coming in gasps. From the shadows, she appeared. A figure in a tattered white gown crawling from the darkness. Her long black hair matted with blood, her fingers twisted, broken. But her face, a gaping hole where her mouth should have been. She moved with jerking, unnatural motions, her body cracking as she crawled toward them. The scream came again, but her mouth never moved. Rachel screamed back. Michael turned to run, but the hallway had changed. The doors had disappeared. The corridors stretched, endless and wrong. Josh tripped, his camera clattering to the floor. He scrambled back, his breath ragged. The woman stared at him. Her empty mouth widened, and then she lunged. Josh was gone in an instant. His body collapsed into itself, bones snapping as if something invisible had crushed him. The air was thick with the scent of blood and rot. Rachel grabbed Michael's hand. "We have to get out of here." They ran, their footsteps deafening in the endless hallways. The walls shifted, the building laughing at them. The scream followed. Closer, louder, hungrier. Michael turned a corner and hit a wall. "No, no, no." He pounded on it, fingers scraping against peeling paint. Rachel turned, too late. The woman's hands shot out, gripping her throat. Her body lifted off the ground as she choked on silence, her face twisting in terror. Michael reached for her, but the asylum would not allow it. The walls pulled them apart. Rachel's final breath was stolen into the void, and then she was gone. Michael stumbled backward, his mind shattering. He was alone, but the woman was still there, watching, waiting. She tilted her head, studying him. Then she smiled, a soundless, gaping void of a smile. Michael did not scream. There was no need, because in the end, he had never existed. By morning, the asylum was silent again. The corridors were empty. The blood was gone. The town would wonder about the missing kids, but they would never find them, because they were part of the asylum now. Part of her. And when the next visitors came, they too would hear the screams. The asylum was never abandoned. It just needed new patients. Days later, another group of explorers arrived. They whispered about the disappearance of the last group, but none truly believed the rumors. As they crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind them. The shadows stirred. The walls shifted again. And deep within the asylum, the screaming woman opened her mouth. A new hunt had begun. Story 8. The City of the Damned. The world had ended long ago, though no one knew exactly when. It wasn't war, nor was it a plague. It was something far worse, something unnatural. The sky had split open one fateful night, and from it, the black tide had risen. No one could stop it. Cities drowned beneath the endless waves of darkness. People screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the howling void. The buildings crumbled as the shadows consumed them, merging into the grotesque visage of something ancient, something that had been waiting beneath reality itself. A skull, enormous and wretched, loomed over the ruins. It was not made of bone, but of writhing shadows, its hollow eyes deeper than the abyss itself. At its center, embedded into its forehead, was a glowing black cross, an unholy symbol pulsating like a dying star. Around it, cathedrals twisted into spires of decay, and blackened creatures with leathery wings circled like carrion birds over a corpse. The sea roared, but it was no ordinary ocean. The water was thick and unnatural, a shifting mass of darkness that lapped hungrily at the remaining buildings, pulling them down, erasing them from existence. And yet, something moved within the ruins. A lone figure, clad in tattered robes, staggered through the drowned streets. His name had been forgotten, lost to time like everything else. He had survived longer than most, though survival was a cruel fate in a place where even death had abandoned its duties. Whispers filled the air, voices that belonged to no one. They hissed his name, beckoning him toward the towering skull. He tried to resist, but his feet carried him forward against his will. The deeper he walked, the more the city changed around him. The buildings twisted, walls covered in faces that silently screamed. Their mouths stretched in agony, eyes pleading for release that would never come. The air reeked of rot and something far worse, the scent of forgotten things, things that should never have been remembered. The closer he got to the skull, the more he understood. It was alive, a god of death, a being so ancient that the universe itself had once feared it. And now, in the final remnants of a ruined world, it was waking up again. The figure fell to his knees before the massive, grinning maw. His mind shattered as he gazed into the void. He heard it now, not just the whispers, but its voice. Low, infinite, starving. You have come to be devoured. The city trembled as the mouth began to open wider. And then, the screaming began again. Not from the skull, but from inside it. By the time the sun rose again, If there had ever been a sun, there was nothing left. The city had been swallowed, the ocean of darkness had spread, and the skull had grown larger. It would keep growing, until there was nothing left but its hunger. But the story did not end there. Far beyond the ruins, where the black tide had not yet reached, there were those who still remembered. Hidden in the depths of the wastelands, a scattered few had survived, whispering the tale of the city that had been devoured. They called it the last mouth of God, a void where something far older than time itself now waited. A caravan of the desperate and the damned made their way toward the ruins. Some sought answers. Some sought redemption. Others believed that within the maw of the great skull, there was something more than just death. Something promised. Among them was a man who claimed to have seen the future. His eyes were black pits, his body riddled with symbols no one could read. He spoke of a prophecy, of an ending yet to come. "The skull is just the beginning," he whispered. "The sky will crack again. The darkness will spill further, and we will all be consumed." The people did not believe him, not at first. But as they traveled closer, the whispers began to follow them. The road to the lost city was treacherous. The further they ventured, the more the world began to unravel. The stars above flickered as if something enormous moved behind them. Time no longer flowed as it should. Days and nights blended together, and sometimes the sun would rise twice in the same hour. Then came the visions. Each traveler began to see them. Shadows moving at the edges of their sight, faces in the water, bodies in the wind. They saw their own deaths reflected back at them, played over and over in gruesome detail. And still, they pressed forward. It was not courage that drove them. It was something deeper, something beyond choice. The city was calling them. At last, they reached the ruins. The skull had grown larger since the last time it was seen. Its mouth had widened, its black cross pulsing like a heartbeat. The air vibrated with an unspoken hunger. The sea of darkness churned, as if it recognized the newcomers. The man with black eyes stepped forward. "It has been waiting for us." A woman in the group collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "What are we supposed to do?" The man only smiled. "We were never meant to escape." Then the sky split open again. The howling began anew. And as the darkness surged forward, as the ruins were swallowed whole once more, the last of the travelers understood the terrible truth. The city had never truly been abandoned. It had simply been waiting. And now, it had more to feast upon. Story 9. The Cursed Reflection. Madeline had always been haunted by mirrors. Ever since she was a child, she felt something lurking beyond the glass, something watching her with hunger, waiting for the right moment to step through. She avoided them as much as possible. She covered the mirrors in her bedroom with cloth, refused to look at store windows at night, and even brushed her teeth in the dark to avoid her own reflection. But no matter what she did, she could feel it. The presence hiding just beneath the surface, mirroring her every move, but never truly being her. One evening, as the wind howled outside and thunder rumbled in the distance, she was alone in her old family home. The house was suffocatingly silent, the walls seemingly breathing as shadows danced under flickering candlelight. Something felt wrong. A sudden crash from the other room made her jump. A mirror had fallen. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, trembling hands lifting the heavy frame from the floor. The glass had cracked in a perfect split down the center. One half reflected her familiar face, pale, wide-eyed, lips trembling. But the other half, The other half did not match. It was still her face, but decayed, skeletal. The skin cracked like porcelain and flaking away to reveal the bone beneath. The left eye was hollow, a gaping abyss, while her lips twisted into a grin too wide, too unnatural. Then the reflection blinked. Madeline staggered back, a strangled scream dying in her throat. The broken version of her laughed, the sound distorted and echoing in the empty house. The butterflies that had always seemed to flutter around her reflection moved, shifting between life and death, their wings decaying and reforming in endless, grotesque cycles. "You cannot escape me," the other her whispered. The voice was inside her head now, pressing against the walls of her mind like fingers trying to peel open her skull. Madeline turned to run, but the house was no longer the same. The doors had vanished. The windows showed nothing but endless darkness. The walls cracked and split, revealing more mirrors, all reflecting that same broken version of herself, each one grinning. "You belong here," they whispered. "You always have." She clawed at her face, trying to feel if her skin was still intact. But when her fingers brushed her cheek, she felt bone. The mirrors shuddered, the images shifting as something stepped out. It was her. Or rather, the thing that had been waiting behind the glass for so long. She had tried to avoid the mirrors her entire life, but now, they had claimed her. And outside, in the real world, her reflection, her imposter, smiled and walked away from the broken glass, now free. Madeline was never seen again. But the story did not end there. The people of her town began to notice strange occurrences. At first, they were subtle. A fleeting movement in a mirror that didn't match the person standing before it, whispers echoing from nowhere, reflections lingering a second too long after someone had walked away. Then, the disappearances began. Friends of Madeline started vanishing one by one. It wasn't dramatic. No screams, no signs of struggle. They simply looked into a mirror and were gone. Their homes were left untouched, doors locked from the inside, but they were never found. More people reported hearing soft tapping from their mirrors at night. The sound grew louder, more insistent. A pleading voice, identical to their own, begged them to let it out. Some gave in. The ones who did were never seen again. The town fell into fear. Families covered their mirrors, smashed them, or threw them into the river. But it didn't matter. The reflections always found a way back. A woman named Eleanor, one of Madeline's childhood friends, refused to believe in the rumors. She had always been rational, skeptical, but when she caught her own reflection staring at her, even when she turned away, she knew something was horribly wrong. One night she heard it, a voice, her own, whispering from the glass. "Eleanor, help me. It's so dark in here. Please, just touch the mirror." Her blood ran cold. She backed away, but the voice turned desperate. "I'm trapped. You have to help me. You have to..." Then, silence. For a moment, Eleanor thought it had stopped. Then the hand burst through the mirror, skeletal fingers wrapped around her wrist, pulling. She screamed, fighting, but the reflection was impossibly strong. The glass didn't shatter. It rippled like water, swallowing her whole. And then, just as suddenly, the mirror was still again. Her reflection stood there, smiling. The next morning, Eleanor's family found her sitting in front of the mirror, staring blankly ahead. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. But when her mother touched her shoulder, Eleanor finally turned and grinned. The town tried to fight back. Priests were called. Rituals were performed. Mirrors were burned, shattered, buried deep underground. But it was useless, because the reflections no longer needed mirrors. They were in the water, in the glass of car windows, in the gleam of polished metal. No surface was safe. It was no longer a curse confined to a single woman. It was a plague. And as the world looked into their reflections, one by one, they vanished. One by one, they were replaced. No one knew how many were left. No one knew if anyone was still real. Because when they looked into their own eyes, they were never quite sure who was looking back. Story 10. The Cursed Convent. The convent of St. Helena stood at the edge of a dying forest, its towering walls shadowed by time, its ancient halls whispering with secrets long buried. The villagers never approached it after sundown, and even during the day, they walked past with hurried steps, never daring to look at the towering cross above the entrance. For centuries, the convent had been a place of faith, but that was before the darkness crept into its walls, before the Sister of Shadows appeared. She had arrived one stormy night, a figure in black robes, her veil concealing her face. No one knew her name, but the other nuns felt her presence immediately. The air grew heavy around her, candles flickered wildly, and the sacred statue seemed to weep blood in her presence. Strange occurrences followed. The prayers at midnight were disrupted by whispers from the empty corridors. Candles snuffed out by unseen hands. Footsteps echoed in the halls long after everyone had gone to bed. And then, the first nun vanished. Sister Margaret had gone to pray in the chapel before dawn. When the others came to find her, the room was empty save for her habit, neatly folded before the altar. The air smelled of sulfur. The next night, another nun disappeared, and then another. Panic spread among the sisters. They gathered in the main hall, clutching their rosaries, whispering prayers under their breath. Mother Superior Evelyn ordered them to stay together, to never walk alone. But the Sister of Shadows remained silent, watching from the darkened corners, her presence like a weight pressing on their souls. Then, one evening, Sister Catherine saw it. As she lit the final candle in the chapel, she glanced up at the crucifix above the altar. The figure of Christ was wrong. His eyes had opened, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. The shadows behind him shifted, and in the flickering candlelight she saw her. The black-robed nun stood at the altar, her hands outstretched, whispering in a language that was not of this world. The air curdled, the flames turned black, and then the crucifix bled. Sister Catherine turned to run, but the doors slammed shut. A whisper brushed against her ear, though no one was there. "You cannot leave. This is where faith dies." She tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed her whole. By morning, the chapel was silent. The candles had burned down to nothing. And where Sister Catherine had stood, there was only her rosary, twisted and covered in blood. Mother Superior Evelyn ordered the convent to be sealed. The remaining sisters fled, abandoning their sacred vows in terror. But still, the Sister of Shadows remained. Years passed, and the convent stood abandoned. The forest surrounding it grew wilder. The trees gnarled and twisted as if recoiling from the unholy presence that festered within. Travelers who dared to seek shelter there never returned. Hunters who wandered too close claimed they saw figures in the windows, watching, waiting. Some spoke of chanting in an ancient tongue, a chorus of voices murmuring prayers that did not belong to God. One evening, a group of scholars arrived in the nearby village, determined to uncover the mystery of St. Helena. They were historians, eager to document the tragedies that had befallen the convent. Their leader, Professor Andrew Wallace, believed the stories to be mere folklore, ghost tales meant to frighten children. Ignoring the warnings of the villagers, they ventured toward the ruins just as the sun dipped below the horizon. They entered the grand hall, their flashlights cutting through the thick dust that hung in the air. The walls were covered in faded prayers, written in Latin, their meaning lost to time. But some of the words were scratched out, replaced by symbols no one could recognize. The deeper they walked, the colder the air became. Their breaths formed in front of them like whispers of the dead. They split up, searching for artifacts, old texts, anything to prove the legends were just stories. Then, the first scream came. One of the scholars, a young woman named Rebecca, had wandered into the chapel. She had seen something move in the shadows, something wearing a habit. When the others arrived, she was gone. The crucifix on the altar dripped with blood, and the candles flickered to life on their own. Andrew called out her name, but there was only silence. Then, a whisper. "You should not have come." The door slammed shut. The wind outside howled like a chorus of the damned. One by one, they were taken, dragged into the darkness by hands unseen. Their screams were cut short, swallowed by the very walls of the convent. Andrew was the last. He ran, stumbling through the corridors as the paintings of saints wept black tears. He reached the front door, fingers grasping at the rusted handle. Behind him, a voice spoke. "You cannot leave. You belong to her now." He turned, trembling, as the Sister of Shadows emerged from the darkness. Her veil lifted, revealing a face that was not human. A gaping void, an abyss of writhing shadows and silent screams. And then she smiled. By morning, the convent stood silent once more. There was no trace of the scholars, no sign they had ever been there. But if one were to walk past its gates, they might hear it. The distant sound of prayers, twisted into something unholy. And if they were foolish enough to look inside, they would see them. The scholars, their eyes hollow, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, standing in the chapel, praying to something that should not be worshipped. And the Sister of Shadows, standing among them, waiting for the next visitor to arrive. The end.